Let us, conscript fathers, think as highly of ourselves as we please. Even so, it was never sheer numbers that lifted Rome above Spain. It was never raw muscle that made us greater than the Gauls. It was not clever tricks that outmatched Carthage. It was not music or art that rivaled the Greeks. Rome's edge, Cicero insists, came from something colder and stronger. Piety, religion, a special kind of wisdom, the ability to sense that the world is governed, at every level, by the divine power of the immortal gods. That claim sounds like pride, but it also reads like a warning. Because when you look closely at ancient Rome, religion is not just a background detail. It is command structure. It is discipline. It is the invisible chain of authority that holds the state together. And if you want to understand how Rome fought, how it ruled, and how it endured, you have to understand what Rome believed it was doing every time it raised an army, marked a boundary, or opened the gates at dawn. Many people assume Roman religion was simply Greek religion in a Latin mask. Same gods, different names. Jupiter equals Zeus. Neptune equals Poseidon. Juno equals Hera. Swap the labels, keep the stories, and you're done. That is one of the most common misconceptions about the ancient world. Venus was not just another Aphrodite with a Roman accent. Mars was far more than Ares wearing different armor. And if you trace Roman religion back to its earliest layers, you find something stranger and more primal than the polished myths of Olympus. Early Roman religion grew from the beliefs of the Italic tribes who lived in the Tiber Valley. Their worldview was shaped by three broad currents that ran deep through daily life. First came animism, the sense that nature itself was alive with spirit. In those earliest Italic traditions, gods did not look like humans. They were not characters in dramatic family feuds. They were forces. Jupiter was the sky itself. Vulcan was fire, the heat under the earth, the threat beneath the ground. Ceres was grain. Mars could be symbolized by a spear, not because he carried one, but because he was that hard, focused power that a spear represents. In that world, asking for a god's parents made no sense. How could the sky have a family tree? How could a lightning bolt have siblings? Then came totemism, the worship of an animal ancestor. Almost every Italic people carried a sacred beast like a banner. Some honored the wolf, others revered the woodpecker, others looked to the bull or the boar, or creatures tied to their myths of origin. Even the famous image of the Capitoline she-wolf nursing Romulus and Remus carries the echo of those older beliefs. It feels like a legend, but it also feels like a memory, a survival of an older logic in which the animal world and the human world were bound together by ancestry and fate. And then came fetishism, the belief that certain objects held spiritual power, not as symbols, as anchors, as living links between people and the unseen forces that shape their lives. In Rome, one of the clearest traces of this idea was the belief in sacred pledges tied to the state's survival. Not one holy relic, a cluster of them. A handful of objects guarded as if the future of the city depended on their safety. In stories told and retold, these pledges included things like the sacred shield of Mars, the ancil, and revered items connected to Troy and old kings, each one treated as a thread in the fabric of Rome's eternity. The logic was simple and terrifying. If the thread is cut, the cloth unravels. But Rome did not develop in isolation. It sat on a fault line of cultures. To the north were the Etruscans. To the south, Greek colonies whose ships, language, and myths poured into Italy like a steady tide. Rome traded with both, learned from both, and in time absorbed elements of both. The Etruscans even ruled the city for a time during the Age of Kings. Their religious influence sank deep. Many of their deities found their way into Rome's pantheon. Neptune, Juno, and Minerva, for example, were shaped through Etruscan parallels. More importantly, the Etruscans helped give faces and bodies to what had once been abstract forces. They turned the sky into a god you could picture. They gave form to power. But that transformation created a new problem. If Jupiter is no longer the sky itself, but a bearded man enthroned above the world, hurling thunderbolts, then who is he really? Where did he come from? Who are his parents, his siblings, his children? The early Italic peoples did not have elaborate stories like that. Their gods were not born. They simply were. This is where the Greeks stepped in. Greek myth was a vast library of divine biographies. When Roman gods began to look like persons, Greek stories flowed in to fill the empty space. Jupiter, Neptune, and Vulcan could now be framed as brothers. Their parents could be named. Saturn and Rhea could be placed behind them like a foundation. Jupiter could have children. He could have a court. He could have a drama. In a sense, the Greeks explained the Roman gods to the Romans. But that raises a question that sounds simple and becomes unsettling the longer you sit with it. How did Italic gods line up so neatly with Greek gods that their myths could be matched almost point for point? The answer is that they did not. The overlap was often imperfect. Sometimes it was forced. Connections were made loosely, based on shared traits rather than shared origins. A Roman deity might resemble a Greek one in function, so the myths were draped over it like a cloak. Over time, the cloak began to feel like skin. Venus, in early Italic life, was tied to gardens, fertility, and growth. Under Greek influence, she transformed into a goddess of love and desire, taking on the glow and danger of Aphrodite. Jupiter began as a sky god, not a thunder-wielding ruler of a divine court. But once he was placed beside Zeus, he became the father of gods and the master of lightning. Vulcan, once the embodiment of fire and volcanic force, absorbed the traits of Hephaestus, the divine smith, and began to carry the image of craft and forge. Even when parallels existed, many Roman gods had no Greek equivalents at all. Quirinus mattered in early Rome, a war god like Mars, yet without a clear Greek twin. Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings and transitions, stood at doors and thresholds where Greek myth had no matching figure. Terminus guarded boundaries with a severity that felt uniquely Roman. Pomona watched over abundance, and Vertumnus ruled the changing seasons, not as poetic metaphors, but as living powers tied to fields, harvests, and the stability of life. And the gap went both ways. Greek religion had figures with no Roman match, gods of dreams, spirits of abstract strength, personifications that lived mainly in stories rather than in the hard civic machinery of a state, because that is the deeper difference. Greek religion often celebrated art, beauty, and the emotional complexity of human life. Roman religion was rooted in duty, order, and power. It reflected Roman society like a mirror made of iron, and nowhere is that clearer than in war. The Greeks fought often, but their wars were not built into the state in the same way. Their culture was not organized around endless expansion with the same disciplined rhythm. As a result, Ares remained a relatively minor figure, loud, violent, but not central. In Rome, Mars stood near the summit, not merely as a god of battle, but as a protector of the Roman people, and even as an ancestor in the deep story Rome told about itself. Other martial deities were honored, and even gods far removed from the battlefield could take on military aspects, like Venus in her victorious form, Venus Victrix, love sharpened into conquest, because to the Romans, the world was not empty. It was crowded. It teemed with divine forces and invisible spirits. Rivers, lakes, springs, forests, swamps. The landscape was alive with presence. And among this vast host of unseen powers, some were closer than any temple. They lived in the home. That is where we have to go next, into the Roman household, where the gods were not distant legends, but daily companions watching every meal, every vow, and every step toward the door. Step into a Roman home, and the next layer of this religion reveals itself in the most intimate way. Not in marble temples, not in grand processions, but beside the hearth, near the doorway, in the quiet place where a family met the unseen. For the Romans, the divine was not far away. It was right there. It watched how you spoke to your father, how you greeted a guest, how you left your house in the morning, and how you returned at night. The most familiar spirits in this private world were the lares. There were many kinds of lares, including those who guarded the whole Roman people. But the ones that mattered most to daily life were household lares, protectors of a single home and family. They were not distant gods with dramatic myths. They were guardians, practical, present, Roman in the purest sense. Every person also had a genius, a personal spirit, a kind of divine protector tied to the individual's life force and identity. The Romans did not speak of this as poetry. They treated it as a fact of the world, as real as the roof beams over your head. In many homes there was a lararium, a small household shrine. It might be humble or ornate, but its meaning was always serious. Inside you could find a figurine of the family's genius, flanked by two lares. Often they held cornucopias, signs of abundance and prosperity. A reminder that protection and plenty were linked, and that a stable household was a sacred achievement. This is where Roman religion begins to separate itself sharply from the Greek model. Greek myth loved personality and story. Rome, at its core, loved function and order. A Roman did not need a long tale about a household spirit. A Roman needed the spirit to do its job, and that same mindset shaped the public religion of the state. One of the most unique features of Roman religion was the worship of abstract divine virtues. Not gods with faces and family drama, but ideals, valor, harmony, fidelity, modesty, discipline. These were not merely moral lessons. They were treated as divine forces. Temples were built in their honor. Sacrifices were offered. They were worshipped as full gods, even without myths. To modern ears, it can sound strange. How do you worship discipline the way you worship a god? But for a Roman, discipline was not an internal feeling. It was a power that kept the world from falling apart. It was part of the machinery of survival. Rome also recognized what could be called momentary deities, gods and goddesses who presided over specific actions or brief moments in life. Not broad cosmic rulers, but specialists. The divine world in Rome was like an army. Everyone had a role. Everyone had an assignment. Annona guarded the grain supply. Subigus watched over the wedding night. Vatican opened a newborn's mouth for its first cry. There were deities for leaving home and coming back, Abiona and Adiona, as if even a simple departure and return carried spiritual risk. This was not superstition for its own sake. It was a worldview, a sense that every human act touched a web of unseen powers. And if you wanted life to go smoothly, you acknowledged the power assigned to each moment. But the most defining difference was not the number of gods. It was the way the Romans treated worship itself. Roman religion was deeply ritualistic. What mattered was not personal belief or emotional sincerity. What mattered was correct performance, precision, control. If you spoke the wrong word, if a gesture was off, if an offering was mishandled, then the ceremony did not count. It was void. It had to be repeated until it was flawless. This was not optional. It was the heart of the system. Rome did not treat ritual as symbolic theater. Rome treated ritual as a contract. You perform correctly, and the gods respond. You perform carelessly, and you invite disaster. A vivid example of this mindset survives in the legend of the first dancer. Once a deadly plague struck Rome. People suffered, bodies fell, fear spread through the streets. No one could understand what had angered the gods. Then a plebeian named Latinius had a dream. Jupiter appeared to him and said, "I am displeased with the first dancer." Latinius did not understand. He said nothing. Later, Jupiter appeared again, warning of punishment. Still, Latinius stayed silent. The next day, his son died of the plague. Soon after, Latinius himself fell gravely ill. Now terrified, he called his family and asked them to carry him on a stretcher to the Senate. There, in front of Rome's leaders, he told the story. The senators began to search for meaning. What was the first dancer? Someone remembered a grand procession held not long before in Jupiter's honor. During that procession, a patrician had ordered a slave to be executed. The condemned man was whipped as he was led to his death. By coincidence, he ended up walking ahead of the sacred procession. The meaning was clear. The ritual had been defiled. The ceremony was repeated properly. And the legend says the plague ceased at once. Whether the story is literal history or shaped by later imagination does not matter as much as what it reveals. To a Roman mind, the plague was not just disease, it was a message, a sign that the relationship between state and gods had been mishandled. In Greek religion, you might persuade a god through beauty, poetry, or emotional appeal. In Roman religion, you secured favor through correctness. You did it right. You did it again if needed. And you did not stop until the gods had been satisfied. This obsession with precision naturally fed into another Roman specialty, divination. Unlike the Greeks, the Romans placed immense emphasis on prophecy and reading signs. Much of this came from Etruscan tradition, which Rome adopted and elevated into statecraft. There were many forms of divination in Rome, but two stood above the rest. The first was haruspicy, the art of interpreting the will of the gods by examining the entrails of sacrificial animals. It was considered the most precise method and was performed by specially trained priests known as haruspices. The procedure was strict. Sacrifice a black ram, remove its liver, prepare it according to ritual rules, then study it with trained eyes, its shape, its marks, anything unusual. The priests read meaning in flesh, the way a commander reads the terrain before battle. Haruspicy was complex. It demanded years of training. The second major form was augury, divination by observing birds. It was far more common, and in some settings it could even be practiced by ordinary citizens. Trained priests called augurs performed official auguries for the state. Their title still echoes in our language. Even today, the idea of inauguration carries the root of the augur's authority. Omens could be read in many ways. A bird's flight, its call, how it pecked at food, the direction it moved, the moment it appeared. Each detail mattered, because each detail was treated as speech from the divine. But the purpose of Roman divination was not to predict the distant future. It was to understand the god's attitude toward a specific action on a specific day. Before declaring war, the Romans would seek auguries, not to learn who would win, but to learn whether the gods approved the decision at that moment. If the signs were unfavorable, the ceremony could be repeated the next day, and again, until the omens were right. This is where Roman religion begins to feel less like mysticism and more like military procedure. A sequence of checks, a demand for authorization, a refusal to move forward without a sign of approval. And that brings us to one of the most revealing stories of all. Before the Battle of Drepana, the Roman commander Publius Claudius Pulcher performed augury. The sacred chickens refused to eat, a terrible sign, a warning that the gods did not consent. Pulcher mocked the ritual. "If they won't eat, let them drink," he said, and ordered the birds thrown into the sea. The battle that followed was a disaster. The Roman fleet was shattered by the Carthaginians. Later, Romans interpreted the defeat as divine punishment for Pulcher's impiety. It became a lesson carved into memory. Not because chickens mattered, but because disrespect for ritual signaled disrespect for the order that held Rome together. And now the most surprising fact of all. In ancient Rome, priests did not form a separate caste. They were not a distant religious class cut off from politics. Priesthoods were often political and honorary titles held by powerful men. Julius Caesar held major religious office. Lucius Cornelius Sulla did as well. Octavian Augustus became Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of the College of Pontiffs. Scipio Africanus, conqueror of Hannibal, belonged to a priestly college. Cicero himself served among the augurs. Rome did not separate religion from power. It fused them. It made religion part of governance, part of legitimacy, part of command. Even more striking, the number of priestly offices was tiny compared to the population. In Caesar's time, when the Republic's population was counted in the millions, the total number of priestly offices across the state was only a small slice of that vast society. That scarcity made these positions valuable. It also meant religion, at the highest level, stayed in the hands of the elite. And this is the point where the story widens again. Beyond the home, beyond omens and rituals, into the battlefield logic of an empire that believed the gods were not just watching Rome. They were marching with it.